Buying a house can be really daunting. So another way to get started is renting. I actually rent a few houses from the landlords and they know that I Airbnb them. And it's a cheap way, lower risk way.
That's Nicole Bansal, about to show us how she went from corporate life to running Airbnb rentals, a path most corporate people never think about. Welcome back to the Corporate Detox, the podcast where we talk about work, ambition, and life in and after corporate. Because, mi gente, we needed this. It's me, Erilsa, longtime marketing expert and your favorite corporate escape artist. She grew up in Vancouver and started at one of the big telecoms there. If you've heard it, it's TELUS, kind of like Canada's AT&T. She rotated through marketing teams, discovering what actually excited her: sponsorships, events, sports, festivals. But adventure was calling, and she moved to Silicon Valley, dove into startups, and even scored a few lucky breaks with companies that got acquired. Then COVID hit, and everything changed. Suddenly, she had to ask herself, what's next? And that question would lead her to a completely new way of building wealth.
To get started, the spark came from something really dull, something boring, and that was taxes. I was still at my
Trying to get a
corporate
tax
job.
break from being married?
I was just trying to get a tax break, period. While I was on mat leave, there's only so much Netflix I could watch while nursing and burping the baby and hanging out the baby. And so I started listening to a lot of podcasts. I went down the rabbit hole on entrepreneurship podcasts, some real estate podcasts. And there was one that I listened to where they talked about this giant tax loophole that you can get through a real estate business, or short-term rentals, I should say specifically. And that year I thought I would get a tax credit for having a child. I actually ended up owing more money in taxes than I'd already paid through my normal W-2 job that they had been garnishing from my wages. My accountant was like, you don't qualify for any tax credits because you make too much money. And here I thought I was going to get a tax break. So work moment for me, the light bulb went off.
What would you say it took before you stumbled onto this light bulb moment?
I think this is like trying to do customer attribution and marketing, It's like, there is that moment where you make the purchase, but really a lot of touch points before then when you decide to pull the trigger and buy something or make an executive decision. During COVID, when I was busy baking sourdoughs, or my husband getting into the idea of investing in real estate. Maybe it was also in my head when we were walking down the road looking at houses. How much do you think that one costs? Because it is something I'd been interested in prior. God knows what.
Okay, this comes together.
Mat leave started in March of 2022. And I bought my first property in September. So I guess technically from like when I really started researching and decided to do it was 6 months.
I actually think that's really comforting to hear, because I've been talking to you since we first started about some sort of real estate, but the time to open up and actually research it is the most daunting.
But the idea, I think, had been festering for a lot longer than that.
When was the first time that you thought, maybe I want to build something outside of this corporate track?
I think all the credit goes to a good friend of mine. She was always about, at some point, building your own business. She thought you should get out of corporate and build something, and entrepreneurship was the way to go. I was very much of the mindset, like, I worked at these tech startups that had great benefits. Like, we're getting catered lunches and breakfasts and dinners, and I had a monthly Lyft credit to take a Lyft to the office, and at the time was very enamored with startup corporate. I thought I'd probably be there forever. She planted the seed in my mind and kept like watering it over time. That was the first time I got an inclination that I might maybe want to do something for myself. I think I had a lot of fear of the unknown and the variability that comes with being your own boss and entrepreneurship versus like a very steady paycheck. And that was the thing that I needed to get over.
There's so many ways to do it. Do you buy your own property? Do you co-host? Do you manage your property? But it sounded like you landed on short-term rentals.
That's where I've stayed, because with real estate prices the way they are these days, I think it is quite hard to cash flow with long-term rentals. It's not impossible. You can definitely do it. And then there's markets where it's easier to do that because the house prices are lower. But certainly in California, I think it's very, very, very difficult to buy a home and with only, say, anywhere between 5 to 20% down. And that's a big misconception I'd want everyone to be aware of on the call, is that you don't need 20% down. I mean, if you get a vacation home loan, it's 10%. If you get a primary home loan and you live in it and renovate it and then convert it, you could do 3.5% down. I've bought houses with just 5% down. I was really interested in short-term rental because, to me, in the markets I was looking at, I just really didn't see a long-term rental cash flowing. I also thought the The moat between someone who does great at long-term rentals and short-term rentals, the skill set required to build that moat was really the skill set I had. It's marketing, it's customer service and hospitality. Those are areas I excel at. And so why not do short-term rental? Because I enjoy doing those tasks, and I enjoy the concept of trying to market my property in a way that will allow me to charge a higher nightly rate or make more revenue than the next property, which you don't do as much with long-term rentals.
I love what you're saying, that it's not just about a tax loophole or what's most profitable. It's like, where's your superpower? Where can you get the most out of the property and actually like make it your own? By this point, you've probably found yourself asking some of the same questions Nicole was. Could I actually do this? How would I even start? Do people like me even try something like Airbnb on the side? The decisions, the risks, the unknowns, it's a lot. But here's the thing to overthinkers like me. We aren't the majority. Nearly 4 in 10 adults are exploring side hustles, from tutoring to real estate to rentals. So if you're wondering what comes next after spotting an opportunity, I've got you. But you just talked about a few things. You go from this research process of, hey, maybe I want to own a short-term Airbnb. What's your next move after that?
So I think there's like a few different moves you can make simultaneously, and it all depends on how much time you have and how quickly you want to move. I think there's 3 things I would suggest. The first would be start educating yourself. There's so many free resources out there. There's great YouTube channels, the Airbnb data guy, Sean Raskadich, Rob Built. These are all free YouTube channels where you can gain a lot of knowledge around how to do this and how to do it well. There's the Bigger Pockets podcast. Yeah, I think 90% of people will probably tell you the same answer who are in real estate. They have a bunch of different podcasts now, actually. If you're really new and getting started, there's the Bigger Pockets podcast. They have one called The Real Estate Rookie. There's On the Market, which is a little bit more economic focused. All 3 are fantastic. And that's where I would recommend starting as a free resource. The second is going to be put yourself out there, start networking. Marketing has brought me so much within the real estate space. It's how I have gotten certain deals. It's how I've built relationships that have brought me additional revenue. And so definitely look up where are the meetups in your town that are centered around real estate. Everyone got started somewhere. That feeling of, hey, I'm not an investor yet. I don't really know what I'm doing here. All of us started. I was like that 3 years ago. And there are a lot of us that want to help people get started. There's an abundance mindset generally in real estate. There's more than enough to go around, and find the people who are willing to help you and find your tribe. And then the third would be start figuring out your buy box. Start thinking about, okay, how much money do I have to spend on purchasing a property? And what does that do in terms of what can I qualify for a loan? So maybe talk to a lender, and then start thinking about how much time do I have to manage this day to day? Do I really want to manage something local that's in my neighborhood or something that could be out of state? My first purchase was not in my state. It was all the way in Georgia, and I live in California. And that was because I knew I didn't want to spend more than $500,000 for my first purchase. And I wasn't going to get anything in San Diego that I could Airbnb and make money on at that price point, because a lot of condos and townhouses typically will not allow you to do short-term rental. I knew I wanted like a single family home, or even ideally a multi-family. So I bought a 2-unit out in Georgia. So start thinking about, okay, how much money do I have? And working backwards from, well, if I need to put 10% down, then I need to buy some furniture. I should probably have a few months of reserves just in case it takes a little bit of while to get up and running. Are there any renovations that the house is going to need? Okay, well, how much can I actually spend, and start then, figuring out what does that buy box look like for you? What city is that going to be in? How big is the house going to be? Figure that out so that you know what you're looking for.
But it doesn't always look pretty. And so I'd be intrigued about how your first property got off the ground.
I knew that I didn't want to spend more than $500,000. I actually had a bit of PTSD, for lack of a better word, from buying a house in San Francisco. So I lived in San Francisco for 7 years. Finally bought a house because I thought that's where I'd be staying. And then COVID happened. So I bought a house in September of 2019, and COVID happened in March of 2020. And I loved that I had a house. I wasn't in a studio on top of my husband trying to work. The downside of that was everyone left San Francisco, including us. We actually closed on that house on September 11th, 2019. And on September 11th, 2020, I actually drove away from that house exactly a year later with all my stuff packed into my Subaru, my husband in the moving truck. And actually, it was when San Francisco was on fire. So my rear view mirror, what I was looking at was just like orange with it in the background. And I was like, what are we doing? Like, we know we want to go live in San Diego, but we can't sell. Like,
Right.
everyone's leaving. We're struggling to find renters. We're price reducing. Like, is this going to be the right move? Definitely questioning that at the time. Luckily, we had to price reduce a couple of times, but we found renters, and we still own that house. But it is my worst performing asset out of all of the houses I own to this day still.
Yeah.
And so I knew I wanted to de-risk anything I buy. I didn't want to buy anything too expensive. I knew my upper limit was $500,000. That's kind of where I had landed. And so that meant I needed to look outside of California. I also knew I wanted to look in markets where I felt like the population was growing. There was jobs coming to that city, whether it be through some kind of expansion of office space or new companies moving into those towns. But I was looking for income growth and population growth. And I was looking for a city that had clearly defined rules around short-term rentals so that I knew going in I'd either be able to get a permit, or if I didn't need a permit, that was the case, and that the city wasn't looking at actively changing things around short-term rentals or looking at banning it. Yeah, I was definitely a little bit helpful in that when I started doing this research using ChatGPT to help me figure out where I could buy houses under a certain price point, where Airbnb is allowed, or what are the rules in these towns where the income is growing, the population is growing. And I knew for myself at the time, everyone was moving to the Sun Belt. And so I was really interested in the Sun Belt states. And so I was kind of primarily looking in Tennessee, the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida. And so the next thing I did was I just started looking at some houses and calling up realtors and saying, hey, can you show me this house? I live in California and I want to FaceTime tour it.
You were just calling up there wasn't anyone that's like, here's how you should call up. Like, were you just finding numbers on Zillow?
Yeah, sometimes I would just call the listing agent. Sometimes what I would do is Bigger Pockets has forums online where you can find really investment savvy, friendly realtors. And I would recommend finding, especially if you're going to be doing short-term rental, finding a realtor who really understands the short-term rental market in that area so they can help you verify that in fact what you're finding online is true in terms of whether this house can be permitted or rented short term, if there's any restrictions, if there's any changes going on in the market. So I would sometimes just use the Bigger Pockets forum to find realtors in these markets that were very investor friendly, are open to the concept of doing FaceTime tours for you. People always ask, why did I end up buying in Savannah, Georgia? Ultimately, it came down to my realtor. He was honest to a fault. My realtor was the kind of guy who would go see a house with me and then he'd drive it around for me at night, like in that neighborhood. He talked me out of buying houses. Sometimes we toured some houses and be like, Nicole, I don't think this one's it. Like, I don't think you should go for this one. This one's a pass, even if I was interested. So finding a realtor who I could really trust was not just trying to sell me any which house, but was looking out for my best interest in terms of, I think this is a really great house and you're getting a good deal and it looks good and the inspection report came back great. And because I bought that house sight unseen, I did not even go see it until I was setting up furniture and I owned it.
How do you know what's worth putting in like money for versus what's not? Like when you're looking at closing and all these kind of things, what did you consider to de-risk this first property?
Doing a lot of underwriting is what we call it. Starting to get comfortable with taking the house and plugging it into a spreadsheet that you've built. Okay, here's the purchase price. Here's what my property taxes are going to be. Here's what I can find for average utilities and all the other costs that go into owning a home. Here's a budget for capital expenditures. My AC broke on that house a couple years in, so I had to get a new AC unit, and I have reserves that I keep on hand for that. I bake that into my numbers for every month. Getting really good at figuring out what your expenses are going to be. And those are generally fairly easy to predict. You should know on average what your utilities are going to be, your landscaping, if you have a pool, what your pool servicing is going to cost. Your property taxes are generally really easy to figure out. Your mortgage, your interest. Do you need to pay for trash service? You know, San Diego is a city where you actually didn't up until recently have to pay for any kind of trash service. It was included. Your water, your sewer. Figuring out what your expenses are going to be on a property. And this is why Florida ultimately didn't end up working out for me, because the insurance costs were going up so much at that time that and it was really unpredictable. Yeah. And then getting good at trying to figure out how much revenue you're going to make. That's the trickier part with short-term rentals. This is where the education piece and the networking piece will come in really handy. If you go check out some of the channels I mentioned, another great one for estimating revenue, Avery Carl is her name. She uses something called the enemy method. She recommends you go and find the Airbnbs in your little neighborhood that look like yours, like have a similar bedroom and bathroom count, have similar amenities. Don't go looking at a house with a pool if yours doesn't have a pool. But if yours does, look at the other ones with a pool, and then go look at their calendar. See how much they're charging every night. See how many of the nights are booked. And you can get really good at estimating, hey, here's how much revenue I think my property is going to make based on what these other properties are making that look like mine in this neighborhood. Don't go looking across town. Your property's right next to the big baseball stadium. You're going to want to make sure you're looking at others that are walking distance to the stadium, because that's a big selling point. But you can get really good at estimating what your short-term revenue should look like after you run enough properties through your spreadsheets, through your numbers. You'll start getting more and more confident. That's always the part that when I first started pulling the trigger, was the scariest. Like, is this actually the amount of revenue I am going to make? Like, have I guessed at this correctly? Because it is a little bit of educated guessing. And then I ran enough properties through that spreadsheet over and over and over and over that I got good at understanding, one, what a property is worth relative to the other properties I had looked at in that city. So if I'm looking at a house that I'm looking to buy and it was $485,000, is this house truly worth $485,000 based on I've now toured 10, 20, 30 properties, and I can see that they're selling. I'm tracking like how much they're selling for. And this one is done nicer. It's bigger. It actually has like a nice yard. That other one didn't. And so I think this house is truly worth at least that much. And then getting comfortable in running your numbers around what your revenue and your expenses are going to be.
You're talking about a P&L of like creating this P&L for your short-term rental and Airbnb. Did you have that nailed down before you go to the lender? Like what pieces did you have figured out before you got your lender, and what did you work in tandem as you were buying the house?
So there's a lot of different kinds of loans you can get for properties. I actually did not get like an Airbnb style loan for this property. I got a vacation home loan. And so my lender didn't care about my P&L. My lender cared about, could I afford this home based on the money me and my husband make at our full-time jobs? So the P&L was purely for me to feel confident in, I'm making a purchase that is going to provide returns. My lender cared about, hey, I want to see all your pay stubs and your history and your bank accounts and your credit score. So those two were actually not very tied together. I know it's actually kind of counterintuitive, but I will personally go stay in that property like 14 days a year. It's a vacation home loan.
I'm sure there are other types of loans. How did you find that lender that educated you on all the different types of loans that you could be taking?
I think like I just listened to the podcast that walked through this. And so I had already learned a little bit through listening to the podcast of the different types of loans. Other ones that exist are your primary home loan. That's when you buy a house you're actually going to live in. But perhaps you have an ADU or a secondary unit that you are going to rent out. In California, we have additional dwelling units. Some people convert their garages and then rent those out. So you might use a primary home loan for something like that. There's also something called DSCR loans. And those are what I'd call more Airbnb style loans, where you need to prove out profit and loss, 20% down, typically slightly higher interest rate as well. And those ones, you don't have to show any kind of income related to your job. Those are purely based on, will this property, this asset produce enough income to cover its liabilities, its debt? And they don't care if you don't have a job and you're not bankrolled. They care about the asset. And if they truly think that property is going to turn out enough revenue.
Overwhelmed yet? Between YouTube tutorials, loan options, city research, endless property checklists, it's enough to make anyone freeze. And I'll be honest, as she was talking, I felt my brain kind of short circuit. Like, how is anyone supposed to make sense of all of this? The one thing that actually gave me a bit of calm is what Nicole shared next. Someone in her corner to cut through all the noise. As someone who's never owned a house before, do you figure out through these podcasts that you want a vacation style loan and then just walk into a bank and being like, this is what I want?
Yeah, you certainly could. I mean, I feel like in the day and age of like online businesses, I don't remember the last time I walked into a bank. You certainly, and I've heard building banking relationships can actually be really valuable. So it might actually be something that's really valuable to do. But no, I just turned to my network for referrals. I started going to real estate networking groups and got a lot of great referrals from people who have agents to work with, lenders to work with, people who are willing to educate me and handhold me through these processes. And especially today, mortgage originations are way down. The real estate market is a little lower than it was the past few years. Lenders are more than willing to educate you to get your business. And if you find someone who's not, don't work with them.
Was there an expense that surprised you that like, shit, I should have estimated this costing me more at the beginning?
Yeah, insurance has gone up on a lot of my property. It has definitely gone up. I think others, how much utilities vary. My utilities are a lot higher in the summers here for my properties in California and in Georgia. Sometimes double, triple what it is in the winter. But I think other than that, a lot of it is so fixed and doesn't change. And that's what's great about having a mortgage. If you get a 30-year fixed mortgage, you're locked in. Rents keep going up. Inflation causes nightly rates to climb, but your mortgage stays the same. That's where you really end up winning on properties in the long term. You're still paying whatever you paid for it 5, 10, 15 years ago in terms of your biggest expense.
So you have this property. You're obviously like in California. It's in Georgia. How do you fucking manage it? Like across the way, did you have tools that played a big role for you? Who was looking over the house?
Yeah, I think the biggest things you need a great cleaner who is willing to also do small property management tasks. And a lot of them are if you chat with them. I self manage that because I have a cleaner who is willing to do those tasks. Otherwise, you can hire out, property management. Typical Airbnb property management companies typically take around 20% of your top line revenue. So it does really eat into your margins quite a bit. I didn't want to do that. So I self-manage, but I'd say the people you really need on speed dial are a cleaner who can help with property management tasks, a plumber, a handyman, maybe an electrician. I haven't had to call an electrician out to that property ever. But if you have a plumber, a handyman, and a cleaner who can help with property management, you're set. I mean, I am not a super handy person. If you told me like you're like mounting a TV, I don't want to do that. Can you just do it for me? And so for me, if there's something wrong with the property, there's nothing I was going to do anyway other than stand there and like watch someone else fix the pipes or God knows what else. And so as long as you have the right people on staff that you can call and trust to do great work, you can set it up. My cleaner sends photos every time as soon as a guest checks out and what the current state of the property. And then after she cleans it, what the after state is of every single room. We have a handyman that we call out for any little things. And whenever he goes out, I always ask him to check everything else. Is there anything else that's kind of looking out of sorts that we might need to fix? The cleaner also calls those things out. And you know what? Your guests will tell you. Guests will complain about anything, even just a broken toilet roll holder. So you will know generally if there's something wrong with your property that needs to be fixed because guests want and expect a 5-star experience. And so if you have those people, it's pretty easy to maintain. I use a guest management tool for all of my communications, and then a project management tool.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was gonna go. As a marketer, I have to ask, what's the stack? What do you have for managing bookings, for property operations, for guest communications to make this hum?
Probably the biggest tool that I use day to day is Hospitable. I wouldn't quite call it a CRM, but it is certainly a property management system or a PMS. And so you can list across multiple platforms. Like I have my listing on Airbnb, on Vrbo. You can have your own direct booking site, and it makes sure that everything's synced to one calendar so that if someone is online and goes and books on Airbnb, you don't get a verbal booking for the same dates and accidentally end up with two bookings that are clashing, which will cause major headaches. So that is the number one tool that I use for guest management, guest communications. It sends out reminders to my team for every check-in, check-out. It is the number one tool that I use day to day. And they've built some great AI features that make my life so much easier. It can respond to guests for you using AI. It will read through your listing description and your house manual so that if a guest pings you and says, hey, what's the Wi-Fi password? It can actually just auto respond for you based on what it already knows about your listing and what you've put into it. So love that tool. I use Price Labs for dynamic pricing because you don't want to be charging the same for 4th of July as you do for a Tuesday in December. And you also don't want to have the same night minimums. That handles all of my pricing, all of my minimums. Those are the two biggest tools I use. A lot of Google Docs and Drives for SOPs, Monday.com for task management. I have a virtual assistant in the Philippines who who does a lot of work for me related to these Airbnbs. And so we use that and WhatsApp,
Yeah.
Google
It was,
Voice.
it's a virtual, where do you get a virtual assistant? Is that an app?
There's a lot of different ways to do it. You could check like Fiverr, Upwork, onlinejobs.ph that is specifically for hiring people in the Philippines. And the Airbnb actually has a call center in the Philippines. My VA was someone who had formerly worked at Airbnb and was very well versed in how the system works, what guests are expecting, what a 5-star experience looks like. And so I was very specific in that I wanted to hire someone who had worked at Airbnb and could provide that level of service. And then one other thing is I'd recommend a Google Voice number or voice account, because when guests call, they can call that number and it routes to all of us, me, my business partner, my VA. It's whoever's available can pick up first.
And all these tools obviously probably save you time, but I'm thinking at times you've overlapped doing corporate and this. Like for somebody who's in corporate and being like, okay, I want to get started, how much of a time suck is this? Like what are we looking at here?
Yeah, I'd say it ebbs and flows. I think when you're in the throes of you've made an offer on a house, it's getting accepted, you're in escrow and you're doing the setup, it's a decent time commitment. Your lender is going to want a lot of due diligence docs from you. And so you're sitting there like uploading all this documentation and answering a million questions, and you have to get your inspections done on the house. You're going to need to start thinking about designing the place and ordering furniture and who's going to build it. It doesn't have to be you. I don't build any of my own furniture anymore. I used to. I direct people now. But that all takes quite a bit of time. So I'd say it's ideal to have your evenings and weekends free from your corporate job. I've set up properties in a month with just evenings and weekends. So you can make that happen. Day to day though, once you've got that listing set up, you've priced it, you got your photos done, the furniture's built, you now own this property. In a week, I think sometimes I'm spending maybe an hour on a property, sometimes it's 5, because you don't know when something's going to break. I had a fridge break on Christmas Day at one of my properties. I did not want to spend 3, 4, 5 hours. I think I spent that day on Christmas Day trying to figure out where I could get a fridge or a repair person the fastest for these people. And that's just not something you can predict. But I'll have weeks where I spend almost no time on a property and others where I'll spend 5 or 10 because something just unpredictably breaks.
Why have you chosen to stay in corporate in those times? And is it challenging to balance both?
I have hired a virtual assistant in the Philippines who helps a ton. He's online from about 1 p.m. onwards. So I really only need to do any kind of guest comms for emergencies that happen in the morning. I wouldn't say it's particularly challenging in terms of scheduling because of that. I have a great person who I put the time in to train. We built a lot of systems. When guests book, they get an automatic message that pre-fills with everything they need to know and anything they need to tell us. A few days before check-in, they get a check-in message with a code to the door. There's an automated post-check-in message. There's automated post-checkout messages. There's automated review reminders. And so a lot of the day-to-day of this business at this point has been automated, and we have standard operating procedures that make it so that there is very minimal management. But if a guest needs something, that's when you do need to be available. And so I'd say you can't take this on if you're the type of person that I think works in a job where you can't pick up the phone once in a while or can't respond to a message on a phone. It could be a great fit for that unless you have someone you can hire to do that. I think I've continued to stay in doing corporate marketing for a couple of reasons. One, I still love marketing. I think I got so lucky that I went to business school and I picked marketing as, my specialty, and that's what I've chosen to do. So I love the work, and entrepreneurship can be lonely. Airbnb business can actually be quite lonely. And so it is nice working with teams on the corporate side of things. And I do want to keep my marketing chops fresh, especially with everything going on in the AI space. Like, it keeps me on top of my game, keeping these contracts or keeping corporate jobs in place in marketing, because I certainly would not be doing any of the work that I do in marketing to the extent that I'm leveraging AI in the corporate space as I do in Airbnb.
I also imagine that it takes time to have that be your only source of income. Is that something that for somebody who is tempted to start, that you're just like, hey, it might be good to balance both at the same time?
I definitely would. If anyone is telling me you can get out of your corporate job in 6 months by doing the Airbnb game, they're trying to sell you some kind of course. They are in it for themselves. It is not a quick game, especially if you're buying the properties with interest rates where they are. And so even if I wanted to completely stop doing marketing today, I could, but I'd really have to tighten the purse strings up. And so doing part-time marketing consulting is a great steady paycheck while I'm still expanding also the Airbnb business, because I can tell you, if you leave your job, nobody's going to give you a loan either. It's a giant pause button on you expanding the Airbnb business. And so that's another reason, actually, you still need the job to continue growing the business, because without it, it is really hard to get those loans.
Right. How are you going to prove your income? You've done two different types of entrepreneurship, part-time consulting, real estate. What has been easiest to get off the ground?
I actually think, ooh, it's so interesting. At first, marketing consulting was easier to get off the ground because I already knew that skill set. And all my business came in through referrals at the time. It was actually two of my first clients were CEOs I'd worked with in the past. So that was really easy. I have actually found Airbnb to be easier to sustain than marketing consulting. The business development side of marketing consulting is not something I love doing. It's not something that I bake in a lot of time for. So yeah, getting the consulting business off the ground was easier, but actually sustaining the Airbnb business and continuing to expand it to become more and more revenue each year has been easier.
That's such a great way to put it. And it obviously could depend for everyone. Another question for somebody maybe on this podcast wanting to be like, I'm torn between these two, just something to consider. Thinking more long-term versus short-term could also be another way to think about how to assess which portfolio career they should be building.
There's also a hugely limiting factor in consulting in that I only have so many hours in the day. And so unless I want to start hiring people and building out an agency, I can only take on so many marketing contracts. But in fact, with the properties, once they're humming, there's that period where I'm buying it, or if I'm renting it, I actually rent a few as well. But once that setup is done, each of those properties typically only takes on average 1 to 2 hours a week. And so the scalability factor on the Airbnb business is much, much higher without having to hire functions out.
That's crazy. I know we're coming at time, but what's the one tip you would give to somebody intrigued by a non-corporate path about where to start?
Oh gosh, I think send the message. So whoever it is that you're interested in talking to, learning from, that you were like, I wish I could kind of pick their brains, start sending those messages. You would be surprised how often you will get a yes from someone. What's the worst that could happen?
To answer her, they say no, or they don't respond, and that's it. That's all it takes to start. Sometimes the first step is just asking the questions. Nicole had curiosity, a willingness to experiment, the guts to try something different. Her story reminds us that the way forward doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to begin with a small, intentional step. A good thing for me to hear too.